Thanks for joining us again on another one of our Safer at Home series. Great to have you with us. Beautiful spring day today. I'm glad to have you here. A couple things before we get started. As you know, all our talks are brought to you by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. And all the books on this on our series are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope that you visit the local and support our local bookstore. So thanks for doing that, and thanks for joining us tonight. Now, if you would, a couple of our rules: make sure that you mute yourself so we can just hear our speaker. And at the end, we'll have questions in the chat feature, like we always do. And if you would, I need you guys to have my back on this one, because this is a subject that's near and dear to me. This is you know, I grew up in this place, so you know, do me a favor, because mom and dad are tuned in on this one. So lie to them and say that I'm doing a really good job, because let's face it, they always like my sister better than me anyway. So so stick up for me if you would. Our speaker tonight is actually coming to us from Pasadena, California, and although he's an emeritus professor of history from Northwestern, his professor of history, as well as professor of English. And would you welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Carl Smith. Dr. Smith, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I want to thank Mark and the Falmouth Historical Society and the Museums on the Green. I'm here to talk about the Great Chicago Fire of October 8th to 10th, 1871, but I hope to get in a little more of some stuff of more local interest, if not of exactly where you are in Cape Cod, of Boston. And I spent much of my life in New England, and I realized that Boston and the South Shore and Cape Cod are different places, but I'm doing my best here. Let me now share my screen so I can show you some images. And now put the screen on slideshow. And now we can get going. I'm talking about things discussed, as Mark said, in my recent book, Chicago's Great Fire, The Destruction and Resurrection of an Iconic American City. It's the first, believe it or not, there's been a lot of stuff written on the fire, but it's the very first carefully researched book about the fire and then the rebuilding of Chicago after the fire. And it puts it in the context of the rise of Chicago and the United States in this period, and larger set of issues, including the fire. It includes about 70 contemporary illustrations and 7 maps made especially for the book itself. And I think they're particularly helpful to people who are not familiar with the city. It focuses on what I see are the key events and people in understanding the fire and the rebuilding and the place of the fire, as I said, in the city's history. It's meant to tell an exciting and engaging human story. It's a narrative history. It's full of all kinds of people, rich and poor, men and women, immigrants and Yankees, children, as well as adults, including the most famous person connected with this, Mrs. Catherine O'Leary, whose cow is and she are wrongly blamed. I'll get to this, for starting the Great Chicago Fire. This is a 1935 painting by Norman Rockwell. By this time, she ceased to be a figure of a scapegoat figure and became a kind of figure of folklore because Chicago recovered from the fire so well. Here's a map of the United States in 1870. You see the states in the east and the territories in the mountain areas and the Great Plains and the other states in the west. And of course, you know where Boston is, and Chicago is right here at the southwest tip of the Great Lakes at Lake Michigan, at the very northeast part of Illinois here. This context in which I talk about putting things is about the development of the country in the decades before and after the fire, the transformation of the United States by immigration, by industrialization, by the communication and transportation revolutions, and urbanization, all of which were most fully embodied by Chicago in the 4 decades from the fire, in the 4 decades before the fire, from a pinpoint on the edge of the frontier in 1830 with maybe 100 people there, to a city with 330,000 people by the time of the fire. Probably the 4th biggest city in the United States, a major nexus in an expanding national and international economic network. The book has an overarching argument. It's that for all Chicago's remarkable achievement and the justification of all its booster rhetoric, it was highly flammable socially as well as physically. In terms of social volatility, the fire and the rebuilding both revealed and in fact deepened and intensified the considerable ethnic and class divisions in this impromptu city. More soon on that. In terms of physical flammability, the rebuilding, which in its speed and scale demonstrated to a large the fire revealed that the city was deeply flammable in the most appalling way. And even though it was rebuilt quickly, there were not a lot of measures taken to make it a safer city. The rush to rebuild, in fact, delayed improvements in fire protection. And there was another major fire in 1874. More on that soon. Well, here is a bird's eye view of Chicago in 1871. We're now on the over Lake Michigan, looking west. Those of you who do not know Chicago, it is divided into a west side, a north side, and a south side by the main branch of the Chicago River here, which flowed, at that point flowed into Lake Michigan, and the south branch of the river and the north branch. This is the South Division, the center of the city and the downtown then and now are right here. This is the north side, and here the west side. The fire began about over here with wind blowing from the southwest, blew this way, consumed the whole downtown and much of the north side. Not to the extent of Boston, but to a great extent, Chicago is built on fill. The city lakefront where Grant and Millennium Park are now comes out here more. And further up, but that's not particularly relevant at this particular point here. Chicago in 1871 was a terrible fire trap, a disaster waiting to happen. You see it, here, I should say, here's another picture of it as on a regular map, one from the book. You see it's about the 1/6 of the size it is now, and here is the river, the main branch, the north branch, and the south branch dividing into the north division, the south division, and the west, the fire beginning here and burning up this way, Lake Michigan here. Much of the city was built like this. This is in fact the house that Mr. and Mrs. O'Leary lived in with their 5 children. They rented out a front shanty and lived in the rear one. But so much of Chicago built at this time was built of the kind of plain pine boards, tar paper on top. And to make things worse, this kind of pine fencing everywhere, and with most of the city with unpaved streets and these raised pine sidewalks, as if you're almost laying a fire, a place for a thing to burn. This even included things like the downtown, a lot of stone and brick buildings, much better, but a lot of them festooned or decorated in various ways with wood between them, with signs all over them. This is the City Hall, which is in the center of the downtown, the same place where the modern one or the current one is now, with its new east and west wings. You see they're a different color than the central one, but this cupola was just put in, a wooden cupola, which was all ready to burn in 1871 as well. Again, Chicago in 1840 was the 92nd biggest city in the United States. It had something like 4,500 people. It was behind Beverly, Massachusetts on the rank of American cities. Boston was then fifth with 93,000 people, just behind Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, and New Orleans. Chicago just kept growing and growing, and in the 1860s, it tripled in size and in that decade, it passed Boston. It benefited a great deal, in fact, from the Civil War as a center of manufacturing for the war. Chicago, for all its being so prone to fire, was in fact, though, had a state-of-the-art fire department. By 1871, it had a professional fire department that was very well trained. It was all steam-driven equipment, no pumping on the side. It also had a state-of-the-art telegraph alarm system. If you want to get into the history of telegraph alarm, this is in fact developed in Boston, the integration of the telegraph and alarm system to signal fire departments to get to fires as quickly as possible. But the problem was a few different things which made the Great Chicago Fire possible. The fall and the summer of 1871 were exceptionally dry in the upper Middle West. There were fires all the time. And in the early days of October of 1871, there were prevailing winds in Chicago out of the southwest, temperatures into the 80s by the afternoon. There were more than 24 fires in Chicago in the 2 weeks before the fire. The other problem is that this fire department, while it was modern, it was badly understaffed. There were something like 200 active firemen for the city of 330,000 people and about 17 engine companies. Then there was the biggest fire of the first 2 weeks until the Great Fire, and that was the so-called Saturday Night Fire. On Saturday evening, October 7th, 1871, an enormous fire burned out 400 factory area just south in this area shaded in here, just south of and west of the downtown, which was over here. The problem with this is that it injured about a third of the already understaffed fire department. It tired out almost all the rest because they fought the fire for 18 hours. And then the alarm that it finally came for the Great Chicago Fire came only about 5 or 6 hours after that. And it put a lot of equipment out of service as well. The fire that began in the O'Leary barn around 9 o'clock on the evening of Sunday, October 8th, 1871, was nothing extraordinary or sinister. It was just like these other smaller fires that happened. But the problem was the city was so fire prone, the fire department was down, the wind was blowing out of the southwest. It was what we would call in other terms a perfect storm, a perfect situation for a terrible fire. And so you can't really talk about blaming Mrs. O'Leary. This was the fire that came in broke out in the barn, and we don't know exactly how or why, but she was in bed at the time, was like any of a number of others that week. But this one grew out of hand. The fault for the Great Chicago Fire was the way Chicago was built. The final fatal factor was an inexplicable delay in that state of the alarm system, which delayed the arrival of the fire crews by about half an hour. So by that time, the fire was virtually beyond stopping, and the fate of the city was absolutely sealed when the roof of the waterworks fell in about 3 o'clock in the morning, Monday morning, and there was no more water to fight the fire with. And so Chicago burned for about 30 hours, from about 9 p.m. Sunday evening, October 8th, to early in the morning of Tuesday, October 10th. You have all kinds of illustrations of it. Here's a lithograph of the city burning. You see the fire that began around here pushing north and east through the downtown and through the North Division here. Thanks to those winds, the fire moved generally, but not unvaryingly, from the O'Leary neighborhood, which was about 1.25 miles southwest of the downtown, across the South Branch, through the whole downtown, and then leaped the main branch and burned the North Division. It could do this because, in addition to the strong winds, there was this very powerful updraft that threw chunks of burning Chicago into the air. And so then the wind would blow it further ahead, where it landed on dry buildings and set them afire. So it wasn't a single body of fire, but thanks to the wind and these updrafts, a whole bunch of fires. Although at one point, the central part of it in the downtown was 1/2 mile wide, hot enough to melt glass, bend iron, turn stone and cement to dust. But if you try to chart the fire in its path, it looks like a crazy desperation play that Bill Belichick might figure out. You see these different arrows pointing different fires that combined and recombined in various ways in the course of the 30 hours. It was an absolutely astonishing and terrifying experience. Again, 30 hours of pure terror and hell, with chaos in the streets as people grabbed their children, their parents, and whatever, their pets, and whatever else they could, and ran. You see various depictions of that as well. Here, the chaos in the streets downtown. You see this man carrying his father, it appears, this man carrying some valuables, this woman, a baby. You see wealthy people in a wagon trying to get through, others running on foot, some people collapsing and falling down. This is all documented in the eyewitness accounts. And they tried to escape. They escaped through the ways they could from the downtown, across the various bridges across the river. Here's an attempt to, here's people escaping westward out of the center of the downtown on the Randolph Street Bridge. And again, you see the great rush for life over the bridge with the whole city on fire. This is from Harper's Weekly, which is sort of the Time magazine, for those of you who remember that, of the 19th century, a weekly news magazine with lots and lots of illustrations. People went wherever they could. They went west, as you see here. Some were able to fly south. Some went eastward to the lake and even just went out into the lake to protect themselves. It was so hot they kept dunking their clothes or any cloth they had in the water and putting it on their faces. And some north, including above where the city was settled, to the cemetery at the north end of the settled area. For those of you who know Lincoln Park, this city cemetery was in the very southern end of Lincoln Park along the lake. And here you see a parade of refugees carrying things going through the Potter's Field, for the section of the cemetery for indigent people in what became Lincoln Park. And you see also along the way, they've abandoned various things that they were carrying as they went along the way. Here you see a map of the fire, of what it covered. It's very hard to exaggerate how thorough it was. We see it starting down here where the O'Leary house was, in a neighborhood of houses like that, jumping the river, burning the downtown, jumping the main branch of the river, and burning most of the north side of Chicago. A clearer graphic representation is here in this map showing the burnt district, which was printed and sold to raise money for fire survivors. The important thing to remember here is that north is to the right. So the fire began here on the west side. The O'Leary house burned this way, burned the entire downtown here, and then, as you see, an enormous amount of the north side, the part of the city that was the smallest, but also the hardest hit. The damage is just almost beyond calculation. The fire burned an area about 4 miles long and 2/3 of a mile wide, close to 3 square miles. It burned 122 miles of sidewalks, $200 million, about a third of the city's property value, 18,000 buildings. The north side lost 13,300 of 13,800 buildings. 3 of the 4 passenger depots, 1,600 stores, 28 hotels, 60 factories, a quarter of the churches, almost 39 of 165 churches. And these losses include everything almost except what people could take that was in these places. And among other things, this left 90,000 people instantly homeless, and more than that, instantly without a job. To put that in perspective, this is the population at the time of Cleveland, Ohio, which at that point was the 15th largest city in the country. It's as if overnight, the 15th largest city in the country disappeared. The miracle is the low death count. Since people could see the fire coming, the death count, it's hard to tell exactly because people get incinerated or lost in one way or another, was probably in the mid-hundreds. Lower mid-hundred, like about 300 people. This devastated city was an unnerving wasteland, albeit with its own eerie beauty. And you see this in some photos of the burned city. There are no photos of the Great Chicago Fire, but a zillion of them of the city afterwards, including a zillion stereographs, these double images that people used to view, and you could get a 3D image because there were 2 images that you'd look at through a special viewer taken by a camera whose lenses were about as far apart as your eye. Here, for example, you see a major downtown bridge, the Van Buren Street Bridge. These bridges pivoted on a central brick support, but they were mostly wood. And you see it just fallen into the Chicago River. 7 of the major downtown bridges were lost in the fire. Here, remember we saw that City Hall. Here's a view of it. It was in much worse shape than it appears here. It was hollowed out in the center and viewed through another ruin here. Here you see what later was called the busiest corner in America, the corner of downtown of State and Madison Streets, and the devastation. This is a few days after the fire, when the streetcars began running again, and you see posters advertising here where to go for aid, and you see the rubble that's here that was a lot of it pushed into the lake to fill in what is part of what is now Grant Park. And you see bricks collected that could be salvaged to be used in new buildings in various ways. As remarkable as was the fire, equally remarkable was the amount of the way the rest of the country and in fact the rest of the world responded to the fire. What's key here is Chicago's position in this changing America. It was right at the nexus of the national transportation network. Every railroad, major railroad in America, either began or ended in Chicago, that you couldn't go through Chicago. You had to change trains there. And it was the center of the national communications network as well. And by this point, since 1866, the telegraph also went across to England. So as the fire was happening, news of it reached other cities, and to such an extent that they held rallies to help Chicago, which they knew of because it was on this in this network, to help the people who had suffered from the fire. And there are rallies in places all over the country right away. And it is front page news in the New York and Eastern papers on the morning of the fire when the city is still burning. It's the front page news in the London papers and the European papers by Tuesday morning. And as I said, here is a poster that you see, it's dated Monday, October 9th, of a rally at 3 o'clock in Cleveland to raise money for the fire. On that same afternoon, there was a rally in Faneuil Hall at which Charles Sumner and Edward Everett Hale, among others, spoke, and they raised $100,000 for the relief of Chicago. That was the mayor of the city then put in an account that Chicago could draw on. And by Saturday, a bunch of people from Boston were in Chicago helping administer the aid. A extraordinary outburst of assistance. Trainloads of supplies and food were already being sent, again, as the city was burning. This included at first other fire engines put on trains and shipped to Chicago, but then all kinds of food. Most famously, a shipment sent on a special Lightning Express Erie Railroad train run by the rogue robber barons, Jim Fisk and Jay Gould. And here's Jim Fisk at the, they're trying to burnish their reputation at a bad time, leading a 6-in-hand wagon full of supplies for Chicago, which they took and threw on the train. And then it goes as fast as a mile a minute to Chicago. And along the way, people throwing in more stuff along the way. Well, this helped very much in the recovery of the city, and the administration of this was very important. But meanwhile, Chicago had to lift itself up. And it's, again, as remarkable as was the fire, equally remarkable was how quickly and fully it recovered. You see stories of people first putting up shacks like this in the downtown. This is a shack put up by William D. Kerfoot, a real estate dealer, very close to where the courthouse was. And what it's also famous for is the sign, which is right here to show Chicago grit. And this is in the Chicago History Museum now. William D. Kerfoot is at 59 Union Park. That's where his home was. All gone but wife, children, and energy. But meanwhile, until the downtown was declared, business had to move elsewhere. They rented places in unburned areas. They moved into some houses that were nearby. But slowly, the city was rebuilt first, and then that went with increasing speed. So the first thing you see are these kind of knocked together wooden stores along Michigan Avenue in the downtown. It looks like the set of a movie with Gary Cooper in it, in fact. But this is right in what was downtown Chicago, with the 5th biggest body of fresh water in the world right behind it in Lake Michigan. The businesses made whatever they could. Marshall Field, the famous department store, rented a railroad car barn on the edge of the city and cleaned it out and started selling their fine goods there again. Again, the building started slowly but picked up rapidly, first commercial building and then domestic building. You see by the spring and the summer of 1872 and into 1873, buildings like this going up, using derricks, also building even in cold weather, putting salt and other things in the cement, but a lot of accidents, very, very unsafe in many ways. So that by the fall of 1873, there was an entirely new downtown. Here's a map of it. I know this doesn't mean much, but again, the north is to the right. The point that this reveals is the new downtown was about twice the size of the pre-fire downtown. And this is within 2 years of the fire. And the only thing that stopped this was the Great Panic of 1873, a terrible financial crash. Then a lot of people think that right when Chicago was rebuilt, it meant the new skyscrapers for which Chicago is known were put up immediately. That is not, in fact, the case. The new buildings in the downtown were stronger and a little bit higher, but still were more buildings like this. This is one of the very few survivals from this period, a 5-story Washington block that's on the edge of the downtown, of the center of the downtown. You see here a post-fire region map. You see in the dark area, the area of the city destroyed by the fire, and the rest of the city continuing on. The city celebrated its recovery there's a great exposition, the Interstate Exposition held in the fall of 1873 in this grand three-cupolaed building built along the lakefront. All kinds of industrial displays of different kinds of companies put on there, and a whole series of art exhibits. For those of you who've been to Chicago, to cite this in your mind, this was torn down less than 20 years later, and this is the site of the original buildings of the Art Institute of Chicago at Michigan Avenue. There was an even bigger party showing the full recovery of Chicago in 1893 at the Columbian Exposition of 1893, probably the most successful World's Fair in American history. This is the Court of Honor, so-called Court of Honor, the major exhibition buildings of the fair. And October 9th was set aside as Chicago Day, and something like 700,000 people came to the fair that day. And there was, of course, great parades and floats and all kinds of things, and somewhat counterintuitively, an enormous fireworks display. The point I want to make that I can't talk about in great detail, but is certainly discussed in great detail in the book, is that this rebuilding was hardly smooth or simple or unanimous. The fire, as I said before, revealed economic, ethnic, and religious division in a city whose social structure was as improvised and flammable as its physical structure. Chicago grew so fast, which meant that everybody was, or an enormous amount of the population was a recent arrival, and usually a recent arrival from far away. At the time of the fire, close to 50% of Chicagoans were born in another country. The largest ethnic group, Germans, and right behind that, Irish, who came earlier and were bigger, but then surpassed by this point by the German. So 1 in 5 people in Chicago were born in Germany. Close to 1 in 7 were born in Ireland. And when you throw in their children, either a person who's either from another country or has at least one parent born abroad, is close to 80% of the population. The 20% of native Chicagoans consist in significant part of people from the Northeast, New York, the Middle Atlantic states, and New England. And these people, a lot of them from not just Massachusetts. Marshall Field is from Massachusetts, but upstate New York, where George Pullman is from, but Maine, New Hampshire, and other places, owned virtually 100% of the property and the wealth in the city. And so there is this great tension that breaks down in terms of ethnicity and class, and the case particularly when you throw in a lot of the Irish population, but some of the German population, religion. And most working people, the great majority of Chicagoans, are foreign-born or children of foreign-born. And there's tremendous political tensions. And these get, if anything, riled rather than smoothed in the fire and the recovery in ways the book talks about, and leads to much greater social violence in the 80s and 90s, famous events like the Haymarket bombing and the Pullman strike. The other issue is, in spite of all this triumph, of the wonderful triumph, is that, as I've said before, fires kept happening in American cities. It really wasn't until early in the 20th century that serious fire protection was in place. As I said, Chicago had another major downtown fire, nowhere near the size, in the summer of 1874. And it wasn't until the national insurer said they would not write more fire insurance for Chicago unless it shaped up that serious reforms began, but even those were very slow. As many of you know, and this is where I say I'll get back to Boston, 13 months after the Great Chicago Fire, on November 9th, 1872, Boston suffered the worst fire in its history. And this looks remarkably similar. Here's a photograph of a panoramic photograph of the ruins of downtown Boston in 1873. The burnt district in Chicago was 30 times bigger than the district burned in Boston, but the losses in Chicago were only 3 times bigger because it burned in many places key parts of the commercial downtown. You see a map of the area that burned in 1872. Here is, of course, the Common and the Boston Garden, and a public garden is just starting at this point, and Back Bay beyond that. But here, obviously the older city, much of which is by this point filled. Well, Chicagoans reacted very generously in reciprocity to what Boston did. They had a rally in the new Chamber of Commerce building, and they raised an enormous amount of money as well, although we're told that the first person to pledge anything was a peanut vendor named Kennedy, who pledged $5, and there was a tremendous uproar after that. Chicagoans, of course, being Chicagoans, bragged that their fire was so much bigger than Boston's puny fire. They also couldn't help remembering some ministers who said one reason Chicago burned was because it was an evil and immoral city, as opposed to places like Boston. And they wondered now how those ministers would explain the fate of Boston. It was now the obligation of those same clergymen to explain how, and this is a quotation, how a fiery visitation almost as terrible struck the city of Boston. Well, that's enough for now. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. There's a great deal more in the book and a great deal more to say. And why don't I stop sharing now?
Dr. Smith, that was excellent. If you got a question, make sure you use the chat feature down below. What was the population of Chicago in 1871? What are we talking about in terms of numbers?
It's more or less an estimate. 330,000 people. The 1871 census said 300,000, 298,000. And Boston at that point was about 250,000.
And you did mention about Mrs. O'Leary's barn. So is it safe to say it actually, the Sunday fire, not the Saturday night fire, but the Sunday fire actually did start?
It started, we're virtually positive that it started in or around her barn. Since the barn was on the north end of the property, one of the ironies of the fire was that, as you saw, her house did not burn. The barn did, and everything north and east of there. What is forgotten in all this is that she did earn, her husband was an unskilled laborer, and she supplemented the income, and they had 5 children from a 14-year-old to an infant. The income selling milk in the area. Most milk in Chicago was brought in by train, but a surprising number of farm animals in the city. She lost 4 cows and a horse and her wagon and the barn, as to say her income, and they lost and was uninsured, their property and her living in all this. And then by as early as Monday morning, with the city still burning, she is sort of singled out as the scapegoat, as the story of the cow kicking over the lantern is in circulation. Never true. And she is for a while vilified, and she's singled out because people want a reason, and they want a reason that fits with their pre-existing prejudices. And she had 5 strikes against her. She was a poor immigrant, Catholic, Irish, 6, illiterate female, helpless. And it was a way to deflect the fact that the real reason for the city burning was how badly it was built. And that comes out. She's exonerated even by the end of this year in a fire department inquiry, but the story will not die. There are other competing ones that were started by boys smoking in the barn, by its clumsy neighbor. There's even stories that relate to the Paris Commune of 1871 that terrorists started the fire. But Mrs. O'Leary never gets shaken, and she is described as a welfare cheat, which she wasn't. She's made 30 years older as this ugly crone. Again, and she can't get her story out, and she dies basically still besieged in 1895 with reporters coming every year to make fun of her. In 1997, the Chicago City Council unanimously exonerated her officially, but that was about for the nth time. And along the way, there are all kinds of other stories. People confessed to starting it, which were untrue in various ways. But as I said, since Chicago recovered so well, and I think also because not that many people, it's, you know, for terrible for them, died, she becomes this kind of figure of folklore, a kind of positive figure, although still in a way that's very patronizing and condescending, as you see in the Norman Rockwell painting, you know, this poor, ignorant, happy, fat and happy, daydreaming or night dreaming Irish woman.
You had mentioned that the fire in 1874 follows, and that's also devastating. And but you alluded to the insurance settlements. What did insurance pay in 1871, and why the incredible rush to rebuild with the same materials that just went up in flames?
Well, it's a complicated story. First of all, about half the property is a whole other history of insurance in America, and fire insurance and fire prevention and the rise of fire departments. Remember, Chicago did not have a professional uniform fire department until 1856, 15 years before this. And that's about the same time as most other cities. So we have that. About half the property in the city was covered by insurance, and there are certain rules of thumb here. The wealthier you were, the more likely you were to have insurance, and the farther away your insurance company was, the more likely it was to pay off. So only while half the city was insured, only about half of that part was paid off, and overwhelmingly by companies that were based in New York and Boston and Europe, while a lot of companies, just especially local ones, went under. And this also took a while. The other complications involved is that all the city records were burned when the city hall burned. So they had to piece together from real estate title companies property records. So that took a while to figure out. Now, the city burns down, winter is coming, people need place to live. They put up whatever they can real fast, including stuff that's supported by the relief agencies. Just, we need shelter, and the way to do that quick and cheap is wood. And meanwhile, one of the things I didn't talk about is that there's a fight along these class and ethnic lines, because the wealthy people, particularly the property owners, want to say, we must outlaw using wood anywhere building in the city. And the people, working people, say, we can't afford that. So it is a big fight, and then a kind of compromise where parts of the city are, you can't build with wood, and parts you can, but then that's not enforced. So it's a mess. And then even when things continue on, it's not particularly enforced, and it's not good inspection. The largest fire in terms of loss of life in Chicago is a single building fire in 1903. This is 32 years after the Great Chicago Fire. For the Chicagoans, this is famous. I don't know if you know about the Iroquois Theater Fire in downtown Chicago, where at a Christmas matinee, about 600 people, and many of them mothers and their children, are burned to death because of terrible signage, fire exits, ladders. It's an awful thing. But even then, it's really not until the second decade of the 20th century that we have serious fire prevention in force.
How does the Chicago fire end? You said it burned for 33 hours. How does it end?
It burned itself out. The fire department could not stop it. It stopped when it had nothing more to burn. Rain did start to fall. There are various opinions on one other reason why it stopped. There was a somewhat crazy guy named James Hildreth who suggested early on that let's get gunpowder and blow up buildings in the fire's path, and that will create a fire break. One reason it didn't go farther north on the west side is because of that Saturday night fire. There was nothing more to burn over there. So he blew up a bunch of buildings, particularly in the downtown area, and he claimed that stopped the fire. That isn't entirely clear or convincing, I should say. Meanwhile, he is traveling through a city on fire with wagons full of gunpowder.
Question here: compare this to the San Francisco fire after the earthquake.
Right. San Franciscans love to say that it wasn't. They don't like to worry about earthquakes. They say it wasn't the earthquake that burned that destroyed the city. It was the fires that followed. The fires that followed the San Francisco earthquake are in fact larger than the Great Chicago Fire. That is the biggest in terms of area, number of buildings, and so on burned. They're all in the major league. They rank with things like the Moscow Fire of 1812, the London Fire of 1666. You know, when you start adjusting for time and place, you know, what proportions of cities burn and stuff like that, it comparing gets more complicated. But in terms of just sheer area, the Great Chicago Fire, for you New Englanders, it's interesting that one of the largest fires before the Great Chicago Fire was the Portland, Maine fire of 1866. And there was a big Salem fire early in the 20th century, I believe 1918. I don't have the date in my head. So these things just kept happening.
Question here: my mom came from Chicago. She once told me that something called the landmarks that had to do with the fire. It was a long time ago. Do you have any information on this?
I don't know what the word landmarks.
Yeah, and Phil, I'm not sure if you're talking about the 4 landmarks that are on the Chicago flag. I'm not sure.
The Chicago flag has 4 stars in it. It dates from early in the 20th century. At first, it had 2, one for the Great Chicago Fire and one for the Columbian Exposition. It has 4, the other for Fort Dearborn, where the city was more or less founded, and the Second World's Fair of 1933-34. Is that what?
Phil, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask. And is it the Columbian Exposition that really where the architects and where the real building of the city as we know today really starts to take shape? Is that kind of the impetus?
No. The city as, let's call it the skyscraper revolution, and the famous Chicago School of Architecture that starts with William LeBaron Jenney and Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler, and then later leads into Frank Lloyd Wright and others. That begins really in the middle of in the 1880s with the first steel frame construction, where the no longer masonry bearing walls, but the wall of frame, and you can go virtually as high as you want as a result of that. And that starts like 1884 or so with the home insurance building downtown. That's a William LeBaron Jenney. And these people all know each other and they work in each other's offices and they share information and various kinds. And other things are related to this. The Eiffel Tower, it's 1889, is a demonstration of steel frame construction. The fair, in fact, is a throwback, if anything. It's what do you call it? Beaux-Arts, neoclassical architecture, and it's just mostly wooden frames with plaster of Paris. It's just a stage set. It's meant to just last for the summer. Louis Sullivan was very angry. He said it led to a betrayal of modern architecture, that people saw that and they wanted to reproduce it, so that until the middle of the 20th century, if you built a city hall, it looked like the Chicago World's Fair. So it was very influential, but not in a progressive way.
Phil, go ahead, ask your question.
Yeah, so my mom once told me she came from Chicago and lived in Chicago, and her family were police department back when Al Capone's. Draw your own conclusion. And basically, she said that there were like 50.
Pure as the driven snow.
She said there were like 55 sites that was something called landmarks. She once told me about. So
well, there's all over Chicago. There are different landmarks and even signs that say this or that, and some of them have to do with the fire. But I don't know. But that's a kind of small overlap. So I don't know what she's referring to there.
This October will be the 150th anniversary of the fire. Do you know what the city plans to do to commemorate, or what's the
Well,
obviously
I'm sure
COVID allowing?
Yeah, well, that's the big question, isn't it? The Chicago History Museum is planning an exhibit, whether people can physically go to it. Right now, it has reopened on a very limited basis, but what kinds of, we still don't know. We're very hopeful the way things are breaking, that there will be live in-person events in the fall, but I don't know. At the 100th anniversary, when the first Mayor Daley was mayor, there was an enormous thing with an enormous banquet in a hotel and fireworks display that went on and a big parade and all kinds of other things. We'll see. What these always do is de-emphasize the destruction and emphasize, how this shows Chicago's tenacity, its strength, its unbeatable quality. One interesting thing about disasters like this is, of course, timing is everything. If San Francisco or Chicago were to be hit the way they were, it couldn't have happened at a better time, when they were on an upswing. And in some ways, it I won't say, be so cynical to say it cleared the way for a bigger and better Chicago, but it certainly didn't change the course of things. Well, when New Orleans is hit by Katrina in 2005, it's a city already on a decline, and it's a very serious blow.
Well, I want to thank you for doing this tonight. This has been great pleasure. I'm glad for you. You're in Pasadena and enjoying the weather. And
well, I'm a great fan of where you are. Let me tell you, spent a great deal of time there, both down where Falmouth is, and then even further closer to the canal, and then farther up along the Cape. And it's just a wonderful place. And I hope it fully opens as soon as possible. And of course, and everybody is healthy.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, I'm all for that. Well, stay safe. Thank you very much for doing it. The name of the book is The Great Chicago Fire. And thank you,
No,
everyone. So stay
it's called Chicago's Great
Chicago's
Fire.
Great Fire. Yeah. And his name is Carl Smith. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Thank all of you.